Here's a question for us. What is the proper scope of evolutionary theory? What should we expect it to explain? And what can we sensibly expect it not to explain? For all intents and purposes, modern Darwinism has claimed to be evolutionary theory. It's a comprehensive theory of evolution in this view. And being comprehensive, there is no need for any other theory. We've outlined many of these claims throughout this series. The Darwinian umbrella includes evolution, obviously, and the origin of species, but also claims nearly the entire scope of biology: embryological development, adaptation, good design, ecology, and so forth. There are some oddities, though. What about what I would argue to be life's distinctive attributes, namely purposefulness, intentionality, and cognition? These don't sit quite so comfortably under the Darwinian umbrella. Indeed, they're often treated as illusory: apparent purposefulness, apparent intentionality, and apparent cognition. Then there's the biggest question of all, namely, where did life itself come from? What does Darwinism have to say about the origin of life? When the topic is brought up, however, it's usually met with a dismissal that, of course, there can be no Darwinian explanation for the origin of life. Why? Well, Darwinism explains evolution. Life's origin is not evolution, so it's an entirely separate question. How convenient. Which raises the other obvious question: on what grounds can such a bright line really be drawn between the origin of life and the evolution of life? Now, I happen to agree that Darwinism does not have a good explanation for the origin of life. That's not much of a defense, though. To me, that's more evidence that Darwinism cannot be a coherent theory of evolution. And the reason for that is that Darwinism does not stem from a coherent theory of life. So in this episode and the next, we're going to explore the origin of life. Here, I want to explore the question: why does Darwinism draw that bright line in the first place? And in the next episode, we'll turn to the origin of life itself. What about the great man himself? What did Charles Darwin have to say about the origin of life? He had little to say about it publicly, yet he was certainly interested in the idea. And we know this from an 1871 letter to his friend, the botanist and explorer J.D. Hooker, written in 1871. And here's the relevant excerpt from this letter. Pause the video if you'd like and read the whole thing. I've highlighted the important passage. Darwin's letter was prompted by a controversy that was then swirling around Victorian science over spontaneous generation. This means life emerging on its own from non-living matter. Spontaneous generation captured Darwin's attention because he thought the origin of life had to be an instance of spontaneous generation. So, to Darwin at least, the evolution of life started with the origin of life. There had to be some connection. And the hope was that both were driven by some kind of natural law. The very idea of spontaneous generation had a checkered reputation, though, with silly tales about mice being generated from piles of dirty clothes or maggots being generated by rotting meat. And you can read about these in any high school biology textbook, usually with an invitation to mockery. By the mid-19th century, Victorian science had moved on from these quaint ideas, but spontaneous generation itself was attracting renewed and intense scientific attention. And Darwin's letter to Hooker is a reflection of this renewed attention. So, perhaps spontaneous generation was a real phenomenon after all, but now with a truly scientific explanation? In the warm little pond, life could be generated de novo from energy in the form of light, heat, and electricity, acting on a chemical stew of ammonia and complex salts. In Darwin's warm little pond, simple molecules would be activated by energy to form more complex molecules. And energy would also drive a kind of upward complexity cascade. Complex molecules would become ever more complex, culminating ultimately in the emergence of something that could be called living. We're going to be coming back to this idea in the next episode because it reflects a common assumption that life had to have originated from the bottom up. That is to say, from the molecular scale, from simple chemistry to complex life. For now, though, our question is this. Why has modern Darwinism put the origin of life outside of its supposedly comprehensive orbit? By the mid-19th century, the doctrine of spontaneous generation was confronted with an immense problem in the person of Louis Pasteur. Pasteur was a prominent advocate of the so-called germ theory, which stood in direct opposition to the doctrine of spontaneous generation. Let me illustrate with those maggots I mentioned. Rotting meat, as we all know, can become infested with maggots. But are maggots produced by the rotting meat? In other words, is rotting meat an environment for the spontaneous generation of maggots? It's actually pretty easy to dispel this idea with a simple experiment. You lay out 2 pieces of fresh meat. You put one under a gauze screen to keep flies away from the meat. On the piece of meat where flies cannot land, maggots never appear. But on the piece of meat where flies can land, you get maggots. Clearly, there is no spontaneous generation of maggots from rotting meat. Flies lay eggs on meat, which then hatch to produce the maggots. These experiments had actually been done the previous century, and by Pasteur's time had already put the doctrine of spontaneous generation onto rocky ground. Pasteur's own experiments on spontaneous generation were the coup de grace, demonstrated by his famous gooseneck flask experiments. His experiments were motivated by a problem that wine growers faced. Crushed grapes, as everyone knew, would just ferment. It was like magic. Was wine, then, a miracle of spontaneous generation? Pasteur tested this proposition by putting boiled broth into 3 different specially designed flasks. In one, he boiled the broth and then sealed off the end of the flask from the air. In another flask, he did the same thing, but did not seal it up so that the boiled broth would be exposed to the air. In the third flask, Pasteur formed the top of the flask into an open gooseneck. This left the contents of the flask open to the air, but only through a convoluted pathway. In the sealed flask, there was no fermentation, and the broth remained clear. The broth remained sterilized, in other words. In the flask that was directly open to the air, the broth began to ferment and become cloudy. In the gooseneck flask, even though the broth was exposed to the air, the broth remained sterile and clear. From this, Pasteur inferred that living particles, bacterial and yeast spores, floated in the air, and it was these which seeded the broth in the open flask, and which seeded crushed grapes to produce wine. In the gooseneck flask, these airborne living particles could not settle into the broth, and that is why the broth in that flask remained sterile. Out of many experiments like these came Pasteur's famous dictum that life can only originate from other life. Life could not arise from non-life. In this doctrine, Pasteur labels himself as a vitalist and an opponent of spontaneous generation. Let's illustrate this doctrine with a planktonic organism called a coxolith. These are calcareous shells produced by a photosynthetic planktonic protist. Stay with me here, this will all become clear momentarily. According to Pasteur's doctrine of life coming only from life, this coxolith can only arise as offspring from other coxoliths. Okay, let's now bring back Thomas Huxley, whom you have already met. As I just mentioned, spontaneous generation was enjoying a revival among British scientists, Pasteur notwithstanding, and Huxley was caught up in that revival. He came to spontaneous generation from an origin of life perspective. If life had originated at some point, after all, it had to have happened spontaneously, at least once. By the 1870s, knowledge of life's chemistry had developed to the point that the possibility could be entertained, even if speculatively. Charles Darwin's letter to Joseph Hooker exemplified this revival. What if life could have originated spontaneously in that warm little pond? And by the mid-19th century, there was even a theory for how that could have worked. Let's suppose we start with some simple non-living material, those salts in that warm little pond, say. Feeding energy into this material complexified it until a kind of ordered fluid known as protoplasm would emerge. Now, about this word, protoplasm, it's lost all meaning to us today, but to the Victorians, like Huxley or Darwin, the word had a very specific meaning. Protoplasm was a kind of semi-living, organized fluid that was the penultimate stage to ordered life. It was literally a protoplasma. Keep adding energy into protoplasm, and eventually organized life would emerge, as, for example, these coxoliths. Huxley thought spontaneous generation was essential for a full understanding of evolution because life itself was a kind of evolution from protoplasm. Spontaneous generation and Darwinism were, for a time, friends. Just as natural selection represented evolution driven by law, spontaneous generation held out the same hope for the origin of life, that it was a law-driven phenomenon with no need for intervention of some divine authority or some vaguely defined life force. Neither Pasteur nor Huxley were opposed to the idea that life had to have originated from non-life, at least once. For Huxley, the appeal of spontaneous generation was that it could be a law-driven process for life's origin, as natural selection was for evolution. And this brought him into direct opposition to Pasteur. Natural laws, being laws, had to operate all the time. This meant that spontaneous generation could not be confined to a single instance when it was convenient, as Pasteur had done. It had to be an ongoing process. It had to be happening now. In the 1860s, the protoplasm theory was the means for spontaneous generation to work, and Huxley was a prominent advocate for the protoplasm theory. And so too was the German evolutionist Ernst Haeckel. We've already met him in a previous episode. According to the protoplasm theory, energy acting on inorganic matter would organize it into protoplasm. Haeckel referred to this substance as Urschleim, or primordial ooze. Continual addition of energy to protoplasm would eventually produce organized life. For both Huxley and Haeckel, protoplasm was a theoretical concept. No one had ever found protoplasm or held it in the hands. But then in 1868, Huxley discovered something in specimens of deep oceanic sediments that he was convinced was actual protoplasm. So convinced was Huxley of this that he conferred on the stuff a Linnaean name, Bathybius haeckelii, named to honor Ernst Haeckel. And it was even registered as a new species in the Zoological Record, which curated official lists of species. With the discovery of Bathybius, the protoplasm theory seemed confirmed, and it created quite a splash among Victorian scientists. Confirmed, that is, until 7 years after its discovery, when a ship's chemist on board the HMS Challenger, on a voyage of discovery, like the Beagles, discovered that Bathybius was actually a chemical precipitate from adding alcohol to specimens of bottom sediments to preserve them. It was not protoplasm. Haeckel never really gave up on Bathybius, or, to put it more precisely, the protoplasm theory, but what of Huxley? Having burned his fingers in the Bathybius debacle, Huxley began to cool on the whole idea of spontaneous generation. In so doing, though, he backed himself into an intellectual corner. Life had to have originated at some point in time, after all. At one point in time, there had been no life. At some later time, there was life. So spontaneous generation had to have happened at least once. But that undercut the whole motivation of origin of life being law-driven, as natural selection was for the evolution of life. From here, things begin to get complicated and political. And that is why Origin of Life has been pushed out of the Darwinian universe. It was largely political. I mentioned in a previous episode that Thomas Huxley's political ambition was to professionalize British science, and that meant wresting the academic sciences from the hands of the gentleman naturalists and the clerical classes that had been dominating the British universities. As part of this effort, Huxley cultivated many protégés among Victorian scientists, professional scientists of exactly the type he wanted to establish in the British Academy. One of these Huxley protégés was Henry Charlton Bastian. Bastian was a prominent physician/scientist. He had made significant contributions to diseases and pathology of the brain and nervous system. Bastian was also a staunch Darwinist, which gave Huxley a prominent foothold in the medical sciences. The other important Huxley protégé for our story was Edwin Ray Lancaster. Lancaster was Huxley's foothold in the universities. He was a professor of entomology at Oxford University. Let's set Lancaster aside for the moment. We'll return to him momentarily. Bastian was a prominent advocate of spontaneous generation, and this put Huxley into an uncomfortable dilemma. Bastian was useful to Huxley as a Darwinian plant into the medical sciences, but Huxley had cooled on the idea of spontaneous generation, and this made Bastian, shall we say, problematic. For one thing, Bastian was prone to a pesky independence of thought. At the same time that Huxley was backing away from spontaneous generation, Bastian was arguing forcefully that Huxley was not being entirely consistent intellectually. Here's the outline of Bastian's logic. The essence of the Darwinian idea was that new species arose through a process of natural law. Logical consistency would argue, then, that new life would also have to be governed by natural law. That natural law was spontaneous generation. The alternative was to invoke some outside creative force, which of course completely undercut the Darwinian idea. So the intellectual pickle. Darwinists could not argue simultaneously that the law governing the origin of species was something ongoing, while asserting that the natural law governing the emergence of life had to be limited to a single instance when life first originated. That logic was compelling enough. What was worse, Bastian was a superb experimentalist, and he claimed to have solid experimental evidence for spontaneous generation as an ongoing process. And that put Huxley into an uncomfortable personal bind, who was having second thoughts about spontaneous generation after Bathybius had blown up in his face. Bastian's experiments took a leaf from Pasteur's experimental model. He filled glass vials with a broth, which he sterilized by boiling it. He then melted the tip of the vial closed. Over time, the supposedly sterilized broth would turn cloudy and brown, indicating fermentation. When Bastian looked at the fermented broth under the microscope, it was crawling with life. And here's a diagram from his book showing what he saw. Clearly, there were living things in there. Worse still, for Huxley, other scientists had repeated Bastian's experiments and had obtained similar results. Talk about problematic. Which brings us back to Ray Lancaster. The issue of spontaneous generation divided Darwinism's proponents into two factions. On the one hand were the followers of Bastian, who we might call the medical Darwinians. On the other were a faction that we might call the zoological Darwinians. Lancaster was their leader. The medical Darwinians tended to look favorably on the idea of spontaneous generation, led by Bastian. The zoological Darwinians, following Huxley's lead, were negatively disposed to the idea. At the time, Huxley thought the Darwinian idea did not need an internal schism when it was already under attack from both scientific and clerical circles, and we've outlined some of this controversy in a previous episode. As the unofficial, but nevertheless very powerful dean of British science, Huxley could not repudiate Bastian and his followers directly. So, as Henry II did with Thomas Becket, Huxley wondered whether someone would rid him of this turbulent Bastian, and it was Lancaster who was all too willing to step in. Just as Huxley had earned the nickname Darwin's Bulldog for his aggressive defense of Charles Darwin, Lancaster had earned the name Huxley's Bulldog. So Lancaster mounted an aggressive and somewhat vicious attack against Bastian and his followers. Lancaster was well suited for the task. He was a domineering figure to the point of being a bit of a bully. He was actually the predecessor for the militant Darwinians of the present day. As a result, Bastian and all his followers were banished to the scientific wilderness. And that, in a nutshell, is why Darwinism came to shun the origin of life as something outside the scope of the supposedly comprehensive philosophy of Darwinism. There was no good scientific argument for excluding origin of life. Bastian's evidence was solid. He was a careful experimentalist, and his experiments had been repeated independently by others. Banishing the origin of life from the scope of Darwinism was, in the end, a political ploy to present Darwinism to the world as a settled science, as we might say today. It was the start of Darwinian orthodoxy, something that should be alien to the scientific enterprise. Sound familiar? In retrospect, it's clear that Bastian did not actually see spontaneous generation in his vials. What then could explain his results? It's hard to say, because from that point on, Bastian was essentially canceled as a serious scientist, something also that we're depressingly familiar with today. In retrospect, the most likely explanation put forth was that boiling the broth did not actually kill all the microbes in it. Bastian did not account, for example, that the spores of certain bacteria can actually survive boiling temperatures. But Bastian can hardly be faulted for this. No one at the time even knew of the existence of extreme heat-tolerant bacterial spores. Heat-tolerant bacteria were therefore mostly a post hoc explanation for the scientific controversy. No one actually tested the idea experimentally. There was no need to. Bastian had been canceled. The political controversy over Bastian and spontaneous generation does leave an important question highlighted, though. Why, on either scientific or logical grounds, should the origin of life be held at arm's length from the evolution of life? I don't think there are any grounds. Which prompts a question. Is there a theory that can bring the origin of life and the evolution of life under a common umbrella? I think there is, but that common theory is not Darwinism.